So, is American democracy on life support? It's a question that feels like it's everywhere right now, right? Well, in this explainer, we're going to break down one expert's diagnosis of the system's health. And his answer? It might not be what you expect. We're going to start with this really stark warning from Professor Nicholas Grossman. He's basically saying that the whole idea that it can't happen here isn't just wishful thinking. It's actually dangerous. And look, this isn't just a provocative soundbite. It's a direct challenge to a belief that many people hold, and it kind of forces us to look at some uncomfortable truths. So, Professor Grossman, he's an international relations expert at the University of Illinois, and he has been sounding the alarm about where U.S. politics are headed. The big question he helps us get to the bottom of is this. Based on what's been happening, is the U.S. actually sliding closer to authoritarianism? Let's take a look at his diagnosis. Okay, so how do you even begin to, take the temperature of an entire country's political system? Well, Professor Grossman comes at it like a political doctor. He gives us a framework for diagnosing the health of the system, looking for very specific patterns and symptoms. And frankly, what he finds is pretty concerning. Now, this term right here is absolutely key to understanding his whole argument: competitive authoritarianism. This isn't some dramatic overnight government overthrow. No, it's something way more subtle, almost like a slow-acting poison. A leader gets elected through perfectly legal means, but then once in office, they start to systematically dismantle all the guardrails of democracy from the inside. We're talking about the courts, a free press, the integrity of elections, all to hang on to their own power. And it is so important to understand that the U.S. isn't in a vacuum here. Professor Grossman points to a whole list of other countries that have gone down a very similar, troubling path of what he calls democratic backsliding. And this isn't just a random list of countries, it's a global warning sign. It shows us there's a kind of playbook for how modern democracies can be chipped away at. So, after all that, where does the US fit in? Well, according to Grossman, it's not a full-blown authoritarian state, but it's also not the completely healthy democracy many people think it is. He puts the United States in this dangerous, in-between category, a sort of political gray zone that he finds really, really alarming. Okay, so if the diagnosis is democratic backsliding, then what are the symptoms, right? What specific actions does Grossman point to as hard evidence of this erosion? He focuses on two major examples that are, well, pretty hard to ignore. The first big symptom he brings up is the deployment of the National Guard to U.S. cities. Now, this isn't just about keeping the peace. Grossman argues that the way this was done was a huge overreach of executive power, and it was often done directly against the wishes of local mayors and governors. And that is a big deal. Let's just walk through how this all went down. First, the administration comes up with a justification, claiming there's a rebellion that needs to be put down. Then it acts, federalizing the Guard. Grossman's analysis? He calls using the military for domestic law enforcement like this a classically fascist move. But, and this is where it gets really interesting, the system started to push back. The lower courts looked at it and basically ruled that the justification was nonsense, stating flatly there was no rebellion. All right, the second major symptom that Grossman identifies takes us outside U.S. borders, to military action happening in the Caribbean. The underlying issue, though, is exactly the same: the unchecked use of presidential power and how that power gets justified. So what's the big deal with these strikes? Well, the most crucial point is that they are happening without any approval from Congress, which is supposed to be a major check on a president's power to wage war. The administration is just unilaterally labeling alleged drug traffickers as enemy combatants, which then opens the door to using lethal force on them. And this has led critics to use a very, very serious term: extrajudicial killings. That basically means a government-ordered killing without any trial or legal process. And this quote from Grossman really just drives home how serious his concern is. He argues that this isn't about national security. It's about using the entire U.S. military as a personal tool for the executive, a private army, as he puts it, that operates completely outside the rule of law. But, okay, a diagnosis isn't just about the disease, right? It's also about the body's immune response. And while Grossman definitely sees these authoritarian actions, he also sees powerful parts of the American system fighting back, kind of like antibodies attacking a virus. And this comparison right here just brilliantly illustrates the difference between a democracy that's under stress and one that's actually failing. In the U.S., when the FCC chair threatened to late-night host Jimmy Kimmel's show, the public backlash was so huge that the network had to backpedal. Now compare that to Russia, where even satirical puppet shows that were critical of the government were just completely shut down by the state. For Grossman, this is proof that American civil society, even though it's under a lot of pressure, is still alive and kicking. And it's not just public opinion. We're seeing key democratic institutions holding the line too. Just like we saw with the National Guard deployments, the lower courts have, so far, refused to just rubber stamp the administration's justifications. They're acting as a critical firewall, really upholding the rule of law against this overreach of executive power. So what we have is a system under an incredible amount of stress. Some parts are definitely bending, but other parts are holding firm. And this brings us to the most critical part of the whole diagnosis, the prognosis. What's the long-term outlook for American democracy? Is the patient going to recover, or is the illness terminal? Grossman points to two critical vulnerabilities, two potential ticking time bombs, really, that could decide the future. First, the Supreme Court. Is it going to be the ultimate check on power, or will it side with a president who wants more authority? And second is something a bit more subtle, but maybe just as dangerous: public acclamation. Are we, the people, just getting used to all this? Are we becoming numb to things that, not too long ago, would have been considered completely outrageous? And on that first point, Grossman is not optimistic. He points to the Supreme Court's really controversial ruling on presidential immunity as a deeply troubling sign. He believes that by giving any immunity at all for official acts, the court has weakened a core principle of accountability, a decision he calls, quote, horrifically un-American. And that leads right into the second, and maybe more insidious danger, this idea of moving the line. You've heard the analogy of the slowly boiling frog, right? Every time a democratic norm gets broken, the water gets a little bit hotter, and the boundary of what we all consider acceptable shifts. Things that were once unthinkable become debatable, and then slowly but surely, they just become normal. Grossman warns that this gradual process of getting used to it, it's a silent killer of democracy. And that leaves us with this final, massive question. Professor Grossman's analysis shows a system that's truly at a crossroads. You've got these forces of authoritarianism on one side, clashing with the resilience of democratic institutions on the other. And the tension between those two raises the ultimate uncertainty. When you stretch a democracy's norms this far, do they eventually bend back, or do they just break? The answer to that question is going to define the future of American democracy.